Useless Monster by Mute Crows. Chapter 13, or Chapter 12. The media have consistently stayed as one of the worst mundane handlings heroes had to deal with. He stomped down the slight sneer growing at the sight of the crowd of reporters harassing students as they tried to get to school. He sighed and scratched at his jaw before walking out the front doors of the school. Izawa had chosen the life of an underground hero for a number of reasons, and admittedly one of them was the minimal to no media interaction it allowed. The closer he got, the more new rabid questions he could hear. Not that he was unaware of what they were after. All Might taking up a teaching position at UA was the scoop of the year for every outlet and every reporter in the district and beyond, wanting to get the first statements and first details about it all. You could spot the uniforms of students trying to get through the crowd, second and third years doing much better at dodging and slipping through the cameras. You could both hear and see Ida giving an animated response to their questions. Tokoyami was just shouldering his way through with his head down. Koda was signing something, followed by a repeated apology sign as he waded through them all. He reached the gates, standing just inside of the censors, and cleared his throat. Near instantly, a mic was shoved in his face, followed by a number of others, and cameras swung around to record him. 20 different questions were slung at him at once that all boiled down to, what do you think about having All Might on staff? And he didn't care nearly enough to even waste his breath on that mess. He was about to speak when he noticed the way one spot moved forward without issue, the cloud splitting fluidly around it. Midoriya broke the front of the crowd without a single question tossed his way, and had so little presence that Izawa probably wouldn't have noticed him either if it hadn't been for the crowd breaking around him. It would have been impressive if it didn't hit a little close to home for him. That small of a presence at Midoriya's age was a learned response. He narrowed his eyes at the ease of which the boy walked with his weight spread in a way that was particularly for reducing noise. So it was likely not only a learned response, but a well-practiced one. You are disrupting the students who are trying to get to class. He isn't on campus today, so please, go away. He waved them off, watching as the last of the students crossed the gates. He turned away from the crowd, rolling his eyes at the comments on his appearance. A glance across the yard, and Midoriya was nowhere to be found. It would seem he apparently made it to the building in the short amount of time for Izawa to dismiss the reporters. The buzzer of the gate sounded, and the wall shut up to prevent trespassing. He sighed and hurried to the lounge, wanting to get his sleeping bag and papers before the bell. Izawa had been on time every day of his career so far, and he refused to be late now. Although the lounge honestly had him pushed into a sour mood. Yagi was at his desk organizing and reading school files he would possibly need on the students he was teaching. There were a number of issues he had with the hero's presence at the school, and not just the media attention he brings. The trials had been a mess, and Yagi wasn't entirely at fault for that, but there were a range of corrections he personally would have made to the lesson. Maybe it was just the difference in experience, but he felt that Yagi relied more on his title for authority than actual strength in his words and confidence in his decisions and calls. Students pick up very quickly on if the teacher isn't as sure as they are expected to be. He grabbed his things and left for his class. A student being sent to Recovery Girl was never ideal, and the fact that it was, once again, Midoriya was setting a trend that was sure to give Izawa a mess of headaches he was not looking forward to. Yet, again, it was not entirely the fault of Yagi's decision, making as much as Bakugo's lack of obedience in the parameters of the trial. He would have to ask Yagi later exactly what rules were set in place, since some kids are completely willing to abuse loopholes where they can. The door snapped open with a bit more force than he intended when he entered the room. A few students jumped slightly at the sound, but Midoriya had suppressed a flinch to the point that it was barely noticeable. It was silent. 2 seconds. An improvement. The bell rang as he closed the door behind himself. He dropped his papers on the podium and bag at his feet. All eyes are on him, as they should be, while he quickly flips over the first 2 pages of his stack for the day, notes on what he wanted to say to them all about the battle trials the day before. I hope you've all gotten rests. I have comments on the trials you conducted yesterday after reviewing them and the evaluations. Bakugo. He notices how Midoriya shrinks into his desk some when the boy in front of him visibly bristles. If you even consider
Trying to pull what you did again, I will have you expelled on sight. This is a training course, not a gladiator arena, and that level of savagery will not be tolerated in a capture exercise.
Bakugo opens his mouth, clearly ready to spit venom back in defiance at his words. Izawa raises his head slightly, a sharp glare and raised brow causing him to shut his mouth and look out the window with a sneer across his face and arms crossed. At least he wasn't setting the look in direction of anyone else. Izawa would have to find out a way to wrangle and guide him soon. There was a level of civility required in a practice scenario, and Bakugo seemed to dismiss all of it, but only in the terms of Midoriya. A fact that was and would continue to grow as a problem, if left unaddressed. He looked over to Midoriya, intending to call him out again on his reckless self-endangerment, but stopped before he even started to speak. The kid is practically vibrating with an emotion he in no way likes to see in any student, let alone his own. So he moves on to the next student he had in mind.
Mina, you need to maintain awareness of where you are sending your acid. It may have only hit clothing in this case, but injuring a teammate in the field can cause a number of increasing issues, depending on the severity of the situation.
She sat a little straighter and nodded quickly. Izawa just reads off down his list of comments and critiques, wanting to get them out of the way as soon as he can, so he could just let the chaos he knew was coming commence. Most of the class seemed receptive and thoughtful about his corrections, and that was good enough for now.
Anyways, on with Homeroom. I know it's short notice, but we need to pick a class president.
The excited uproar of students wanting to be picked would have been called deafening if his closest friend didn't have a quirk that was quite literally based around screaming. He leaned down and picked up his sleeping bag, casually stepping into it. He didn't bother trying to parse the multiple shouts overlapping and vying for his attention to select. When Ida called out for the rest to shut up, he was zipping up the bag.
Sensei, would a vote be an acceptable option?
Ida turned to him sharply, hand still raised high.
I don't care what you do or who you pick, as long as it is done by the deadline for submissions.
Thank you, Izawa-sensei.
Izawa sat down behind the podium, resting his back against the wall. He looked over the students who weren't interested in the leading role. Todoroki was leaned back in his seat, eyes closed. Koda was diddling and pointedly not looking at anyone else. Shinso was leaned into his folded arms, laughing quietly at the chaos. Then there was Midoriya, who was staring at the ground and trying to look as small as possible in response to the way Bakugo was standing and still shouting across the room while Ida tried to organize how the vote would work. He still had that same look, barely masked. Izawa closed his eyes and took a breath. It was time to listen and observe how this bunch of kids organize and control themselves without direct or clear supervision. He also needed to figure out what about Bakugo and Midoriya's history has the boy so afraid.
Deku, you should at least try visiting the cafeteria. There's a lot of cool people in there, even if you don't talk to anyone. Plus, it would just be more time to hang out since we haven't been able to hang out after school at all.
Rebecca ended her play with a puff of her cheeks as she leaned her hands against Izuku's desk. Izuku sighed as he looked at his bag, knowing there was a bento resting unopened on top of the contents within. It couldn't be too much harm to go to a lunchroom and eat. So even with the underlying nerves he had about any school cafeteria, he pulled out the bento and offered a small smile. Okay. The way both of them lit up in excitement over the idea of spending time with him had his mood cautiously rising to match. They all hurried through the currents of students wandering the halls for lunch break. He almost gasped at the sheer size of the cafeteria. The floor-to-ceiling windows facing out to open lush lots that made up the schoolyard. Tables and booths spread across the floor in a neat and efficient way, although some of the upperclassmen have pushed a few tables closer to make a bigger one. The line was massive for purchasing an on-campus meal, but split into multiple rows as Lunch Rush cranked out meal after meal in a pleased flourish. There's as many people as a public park here, Izuku commented as he stood next to his classmates.
Yeah, UA is much bigger than I could have imagined, even with it being the top hero school.
Rebecca stepped up to the counter to pick up her meal.
It's humbling. Just goes to show the many ways this academy educates its students.
Izuku raised a brow as he looked at Ida, who gave a sharp, satisfied nod at his own observation. They all went to the nearest table with at least 3 seats open when Ida finally got his food. Before Izuku could even unwrap his bento, someone sat unceremoniously in the chair next to him.
I'm gonna sit here.
All 3 looked over to a casually bored-looking Shinso, who quickly broke into a sort of defensive tone.
I assumed that wouldn't be a problem.
Of course not. We can go from a trio to a quad group.
Rebecca beamed at him.
I think you mean quartet.
Ida said before taking a bite of his food.
Yeah, like a band.
Izuku laughs quietly and shakes his head as he opens his bento to see a new set of bamboo chopsticks resting on top. They were decorated, much like the other things Yagi seemed to give in association with the meals. A note was stuck on them telling Izuku to keep the pair with him.
Note from your parents?
Shinso asked. More like a reminder. Izuku tucked the note away and started picking at his small meal.
You don't eat much, do you?
He looked up at him. There wasn't really a good or easy way to explain that years of near, if not actually starving, has him still adjusting to steady and regular meals of any size. Yagi had adjusted the bento servings right away when Izuku brought up feeling guilty about wasting any of the food he was given.
Or say much, huh?
Deku talks more when he feels like he has something to add to conversations.
Uraraka answered while Izuku floundered on what to say. If he could a change of subject, it would probably give him the most wiggle room.
Oh, congrats on the glass rep thing, Ida. I think it suits you.
Izuku watched as Ida sat up straighter, absolutely reveling in the praise if his big smile was anything to go by.
Thank you, Midoriya. I wasn't sure I would get the vote, but I appreciate the support of our fellow classmates have offered me in this show of faith in my capabilities.
That reminds me, why is your name oddly familiar? I know we definitely didn't go to the same school.
Shinso pointed at him with a clump of rice.
You see, you speak really proper too. Not that it's a bad thing, like I'm pretty sure we have all heard Tokoyami's quiet commentary he has that are rather poetic at times.
Rebecca looked at Izuku in a prompting way, and he nodded in agreement. A number of their classmates had peculiar speech patterns from what he's seen so far. He fixed his glasses in what might have been a fidget, but Izuku wasn't sure.
I don't like having it pointed out exactly, but since we are already apparently invested in the topic, I am from a higher than average class. My family has been in the work of heroics for generations at this point. I am the second son to my parents that will be going into the profession.
People becoming heroes for a family reason wasn't something Izuku had considered before. If he was being honest, he didn't even know hero families were a thing. Sure, couples and marriages were sometimes founded in hero work, mutual experiences and understanding being strong supports for a connection, but just being a hero because your parents were? It was strange to accept at face value. He was sure, after the few conversations he has had with Ida the past couple days, that Ida was driven by more than a family duty, but he was curious how many more heroes were there just for the carrying of a mantle. Aren't I doing the same, though, in a way? The thought pulled his brain up short, tuning out his companions as he turns it over in his head. It wasn't like he was doing this for family. Yagi was a hero in need of a successor, not his parent. He didn't have any parents to follow in the footsteps of. It had him feeling jarringly alone, even as the other 3 carried a conversation easy about Ida's family and such. He furrows his brow as he stares at his food. He had always wanted to at least try to be a hero, probably underground to help avoid any search for him and better hide his monstrous self. Yet here he was in the top school playing bright side of the social landscape when he lived alone and honestly probably would have continued to for much longer if... No. His shoulders dropped some. He wouldn't even be alive if he had never met Yagi. The sludge villain would have killed him and there would have been no one to mourn him. The feeling of isolation grew further. A sudden blaring bell, far sooner than the lunch bell should be, makes the whole
Table flinch in surprise. What?
An automated voice calls over the intercom, informing of a high-level security breach and directing students to evacuate immediately. Izuku's every instinct flipped into escape mode as he mapped out the fastest route to a back street that wouldn't be busy at this time of day and allow a quick disappearing act if executed correctly. He could run. He always could run. That was the one thing he had a history of actually succeeding at most of the time. Yet before he could start in any one direction, he was swept up in the crowd of panicking students. He did his best to push his way out of the group, but there was chaos within the core of the student body. There were too many people almost on top of him trying to push out of the cafeteria and doing nothing but make it harder to actually get anywhere. The fear in the shouts of people near his ear had his heartbeat ticking faster and faster. His quirk was picking up on more and more things in a snowballing effect of sensitivity. Bruises and stepped-on feet, or tails and accidentally jabbed ribs and eyes and other body parts blooming across them, all like a sickly field of flowers. It was a lot, and growing, as the shouts for people to move got louder to the point that Izuku could tell he wasn't reacting well. He covered his ears in a weak attempt to muffle it all, even as it just made his own pulse sound that much louder. His eyes unfocused dangerously in a way that reminds him of the panic he had in the park around Yagi, so he does the only thing he can think to do to ground himself. He grabs onto every single bruise and injury he can feel and balls! The crowd was settling, and fast, for a reason Izuku doubts is his own doing, continuing to pull every last ache he can feel, even the ones beyond the immediate hall he was in. He backs up, mumbling apologies as he turns and pushes out of the crowd and into the cafeteria again, people more willing to give him the space to slip through now that they were calmer. Breaking through the back of the crowd as he's choking on his own breath. He thinks someone asked if he was okay, so he just makes a non-committal sound and makes his way to the table they had been swept away from. His skin tender from bruises and eyes watering with foreign pressure. The static worked surprisingly well to keep him grounded enough not to spiral, a mockingly morbid comfort as he finds his bento and haphazardly wraps it again. The students were still being directed to evacuate, but he disregards it all, hoping to be able to blame getting lost if he gets caught and bolts back to the classroom. Izuku sits with his forehead pressed against the desk as he curls in on himself. It probably was something that would get him in trouble not following evacuation instructions, but the silence of the classroom was a blessing. It didn't get him in trouble in the end. The first student back to the classroom didn't even acknowledge him. The rest were quick to follow in, and they chattered loudly over the strangeness and stupidity of the press to break into a school just to talk to a person who wasn't even on campus. Now, All Might was an icon, but the school couldn't just manifest him if it wasn't on campus. Although Izuku knew that wasn't exactly true, All Might may not be actively walking around, but Yagi was on campus today. He had seen him before school and could feel his rattling longing even from here. Familiarity making it easier to pick him out from farther and farther away over the time they've known each other. Not that he would bring this up. He pressed absently on some of his new bruises that were thankfully hidden under his uniform. The warm pressure of his nerves overwriting the pain, partially, with the feeling of contact was nice. The tingling of when he pressed a little harder before stopping, helping him focus. A teacher entered the room and the clatter cut off as lessons quickly began. It was only day 3 of UA, and Izuku was having some doubts about his own capabilities in the wake of being swept into the panic of the chaos that was lunch. Heroes were supposed to keep level heads, right? He didn't want to let Yagi down, though, and didn't want to just give up on his childhood dream again. Not so soon after he found hope again for that long-forgotten and abandoned dream. Izuku waited on campus after the final bell. He dodged his classmates efficiently and found a patch of sunny grass that was comfortably soft to lay on while the day passed. He had no jobs to go to, unable to find one to pick up. The buildings and yard slowly clear as the sun sank in the sky. The blue was changing to oranges and reds by the time Yagi finally wandered out, adjusting the satchel over his shoulder. He's quick to get up and jog over to him. "Are you busy, Yagi-san?" Not at all, Izuku. Do you need something?
Yagi smiled at him warmly, a hand finding his shoulder and guiding him to walk alongside his mentor.
Can we just walk? I'm not sure if I have, things to talk about, really.
That's fine with me, my boy.
They walked through the gates in silence as Yagi pulled out his phone. The need for any line of conversation to be maintained long gone between the two. They wandered streets in a general direction that Yagi was guiding them along. It was towards a more wealthy block of the city with more lights and less back streets. thus rather unfamiliar to Izuku. Still, he felt comfortable enough to relax with Yagi leading the way through the after-work crowds. The mix of people walking home, talking on phones, or just running errands, creating a rather mundane atmosphere.
I'm worried I won't make it through the school year. I just don't want to let you down.
Izuku picked at his backpack strap, keeping his eyes ahead. He wasn't confident he could continue the topic if he had to make eye contact. He could feel the surprised look from Yagi settle on him as the man stops a moment before taking a bit of a skipping step to fall back in line with him.
Even if you don't make it through your way, you wouldn't let me down as long as you were trying.
He takes a breath, thinking over his next words.
Everyone has limits. You can't expect to be pushing past them 24/7 and survive just fine. You criticized me on that one the first time we met without even knowing.
Izuku smiles a bit.
If you end up leaving your way behind, I would still support and train you as best I can, Izuku. The school is a bonus, not a requirement.
Okay.
Come on, let's find some place we can just people watch and unwind. I imagine today was hectic with that alarm.
He pressed gently on a bruise near his backpack strap. The tingling was warm.
Yeah, it kind of was.